Nation in Conversation is proudly brought to you by AFGRI, NGET, Grain SA, John Deere, Monsanto, Nedbank and Senves.
Good day and welcome to Nation in Conversation from Nampo Harvest Day. I am Pumelelo Mkabela. Remember to follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse. The Nation in Conversation app is available in the App Store. For more information, visit the website nationinconversation.co.za. Today we are discussing the topic, the politics of food. We know in South Africa that the politics of the belly, of food, often dominates headlines in newspapers and television. However, today we are not talking about the politics of the belly as in people who are eating because they've not been eating for too long. They now say it's our time to eat. We are talking about the politics of producing our food. Who produces our food? With what combination of resources and policies? In whose interest? To whose benefit? Can it be sustained? We know that the politics of the belly is a short-termist kind of consumption. It's basically corruption. But the politics of producing our food, surely it should be sustainable because it's about our life. To discuss this topic further, we are joined in the panel by Mzugu Sikobo, who is a professor in political economy at the University of Johannesburg, who is also a risk analyst. We have Prince Mashele, a hard-hitting columnist for the Sowetan, who is based at the University of Pretoria, where he teaches politics. We have Mr. Joe Moswangani, who is group executive at Senves. To start the debate, let's start with you, Professor Kobo. What is your understanding of the politics of food, and how do we think that we can make it sustainable?
Well, just to start off with, politics and food are highly related. One of the definitions of politics, for an example, is that it's to study contestation over limited resources, and food is one of the most crucial resources that fuels the life of individuals, of households, of communities, and the nation and the nations. In the context of South African history, we know, for an example, that there is a tension around who owns and controls the supply chain of the food sector. There's a tension between, for an example, government and business over issues such as land redistribution, land reform, who participates in the value chain. The industry, on the other hand, is raising issues about the fragmentary nature in which the government policies are defined and how they are implemented. So essentially, we have a situation where a critical resource such as food lacks leadership by both the state and business, because the two are always at each other's throats. They are always criticizing each other. If you read, for an example, the Farmers Weekly week on week, and some of the articles that are published there by the farming community, you would think that the government is the only player that throttles the sector.
But we'll come back to the tension and the consequences of that tension and whether perhaps it can be channeled to positive energy. But let's introduce Prince into the discussion. Prince, what's your perspective around the politics of food?
Well, the politics of food is not different from the politics of politics in South Africa. The politics of food is about who produces the food that I ate this morning. You know, as I was driving here, I saw vast tracts of maize on the side of the road and sunflower. And I thought of the breakfast that Julius Malema had this morning. And I said to myself, probably he does not know that the oil that was used to cook his bacon comes from this part of the world. But the guy makes a lot of noise about taking land without compensation and so on. The point I want to make is simple. Who produces our food? Do we have a situation of us versus them? And I think in South Africa, that is the core of the politics.
But is it not a question of Julius benefits from this production because he can buy and consume the food, but he doesn't benefit from the profit that gets made out of the food? Is that not the issue?
It is all about that. If you look, I mean, let's be open about it. We are here at an agricultural show. If you look around, the food in this country is produced by white people, right? White people feed vast millions of black people, but black people, wherever they are, they actually don't know who are these people who are feeding them, right? So the question is, how do we create a situation where there is no us versus them in the production of food? That relates, one, to job creation, but it also relates to ownership of the process that produces food, because there's wealth to be made out of that.
Right there, let's bring in Mr. Maswangani, because he's involved exactly in that part you're talking about. Because his company, Senves, is one of the huge agricultural companies in South Africa. What's your perspective, Mr. Maswangani?
I think just taking from what Mzi said and what Prince highlighted, for me there's really three issues. The one is talking about the food system. So looking at the whole value chain of food production to a point of consumption and the politics that are involved in that, including the ownership and control of resources. The second one is accessibility to that food and the affordability of that food. The third point is the policies that government comes up with and the regulations that are passed by government towards those people that produces food and in whose interest those policies are actually passed. And to what extent do those policies facilitate accessibility to food as well as affordability of that food for the majority of our people? So the politics of food involve how food is produced and what options does it provide for people to be able to access and afford that food.
Yeah, it is, I think, in that context that Mzugisi referred to the tension between the different players in that space. But how can it be resolved? Is it perhaps a healthy tension or is it destructive as you see it?
I think the first thing we need to understand is that even though South Africa is not a food insecure country, say, compared to sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact it's ahead of countries like China, Russia, and India, measured by the Economist Intelligence Unit, we number 41 out of 109 countries. But in recent times, we've seen threats to our food security, especially if you look at the General Household Survey of Stats SA in 2012, where it was said that 14 million people are becoming food insecure. And many of these are in women and children-headed households. So there is the real question about the sustainability of our food system, of the production.
Are you attributing that to the tension that you referred to?
Partly because if you want to encourage investment into the food value chain, you need to have predictable policies. They need to be very clear, and they need to encourage certainty. So that if you're an investor, you do so knowing that your returns are not going to be wiped off as a result of poor policies. So for example, the exchange rate is not going to be affected by that. So that's just one side. On the other hand, you have this slew of legislation from government, which many farmers have regarded as intended at throttling them. Now, my argument is always that if the farming community, especially agribusiness, the major commercial farming entities, had taken proactive steps on transformation and not waited for government to introduce these regulations, there would not be a need for regulation. So what is lacking is enlightened self-interest from the business community. But where we need to go to...
Hang on there. I want to go back to the issue of businesses feeling throttled, as you put it. Do you feel throttled?
Well, throttled to the extent that there is policy uncertainty most of the time. Different government departments that relate to food producing industry talk about different issues that are in conflict a lot of times. If you listen to the Department of Land Affairs and what the Department of Agriculture says, quite often they don't actually speak in tandem. They're not in synergy. That's the one.
Give us one example, because, you know, this issue of policy uncertainty, you know, it looks like people just throw it out there without substantiating it. Give us one example of a policy that throttles you.
The one example is the 50-50 policy, for example. This has been going on for a number of months and years.
You're referring to land ownership?
Exactly. If you are a farmer and you are sitting in your farm producing, and the government keeps talking about this 50-50, and there is no clarity as to exactly what it means, what are the implications, who is going to pay for the implementation of that policy, you stay back and not invest as much as you would have invested. That affects the level of productivity.
I think that speaks to the whole issue that Prince raised earlier, that Julius Malema may not know who actually produced his plate of breakfast. But I think the issue is that Julius says, you know, all the land must go to the people who were original inhabitants on it. It must all be nationalized for the benefit of black people who were dispossessed in the past. So he wants black people to produce their own food. And I think that that's actually the issue that needs to be debated. But for now, let's end this session. When we come back, Prince is going to tackle it from there. Thank you. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Let's pick up the discussion from where we left it off. Prince, he was talking about the 50% land reform policy of the government that has been mooted. And he thinks that's the policy that is throttling them, that's introducing uncertainty in the agricultural sector. Shouldn't black people be given back land?
Well, you can give black people land today if you want. And so what? I mean, farming is not a thing that you wake up and just do and you thrive. It's a technical process. You have to give black people land on the basis of having first trained them on how to farm. If you were to give me land, for example, right? I live in the suburb, I don't know what it means to farm. There would be starvation in South Africa because there would be no food, because I can't produce food. Now, if you talk about 50-50, don't talk about 50-50 without talking about training and skills production. And that's the problem of the talk, for example, by Julius. He's calling for land to be taken from white people. If he were to do that, he would go hungry, because, you see, what gives him energy to say all the things that he says is the breakfast that he receives every morning from white people. So what you need to do is to say, over a period of time, how do you produce skills among black people in order for them to farm commercially and not disrupt food security in South Africa? And that's not a debate that we've been having. The debate is they have stolen our land, bring back our land. In fact...
But is that not a justifiable concern?
By the way, Mpumelelo, government, the black government, has conducted a survey. What they have found is that the land that they've given back to black people, land that was productive before it was given back to black people, it's no longer productive, right? So do you continue with a policy like that you see that it's not actually producing results? It's foolishness, that kind of a policy. You need training, but you also need, by the way, buy-in by the agricultural sector. In other words, white farmers must also buy into it, because if they don't buy into sharing with black people, the us versus them mentality will prevail. And I can tell you, we can't build a country.
But are you saying that because the farmers now feel throttled, as Mzukisi puts it, now it's the government now that must be throttled by the farmers? Mzukisi, let's come to you.
Well, I think we've got to, move. The first point is that I think we need to have a shared understanding of what needs to be done in South Africa regarding transformation. I don't necessarily think that the farming community or business should adopt uncritically government's position on transformation, but they need to participate in defining it in a fair manner. For example, in the Afrikaner community, in the 20s, 30s, and the 30s, the notion of rechtstelling, sense of justice, was quite glaring. It was a driver of empowerment. In fact, even the land distribution in that community, you had to exercise your right as a beggar. So you get onto a horse and you travel for an hour, one vertical line and one horizontal line, and that hectareage belongs to you. But underneath all of that, there were support mechanisms with inputs, with cooperatives, with agricultural schools, with marketing boards, and so on. So it was a system with financing. So the white Afrikaans community is not genetically wired to be farmers as opposed to black people. I think black people with the right support, the right kind of support, and the right kind of willingness on both sides, that is from the farming community as well as from government, to work together to create a thriving and prosperous black commercial farming community. Just a final point here. I don't think, I'm critical of how government has implemented some of these policies. Take, for an example, the land bank. There was an agri-BEE fund that was put in place in 2007 with 229 million rands approximation from the National Treasury. And that fund was suspended in 2012 because it was defrauded by officials at the land bank. It was suspended for 3 years. Out of 6 projects that were earmarked for black people to get equity in viable commercial farms, only 1 was approved. So we've got to look at both sides. But the key thing is to get both to work together. Because if they don't, entities such as Julius Malema's EFF will implement a chaotic land redistribution process, and that's undesirable for food security in the long term.
I think that's the issue. How do we move away from this selfish interest where different stakeholders, well, people who are supposed to be stakeholders, have retreated to shells where they look after their own selfish interest, regardless of other sectors' interest? How do we get around that to realize that actually we all have a stake in this thing? Prince, how do we get around that?
Firstly, we will get to that point. If we decide not to move towards that position, reality will remind us that we have to get to that point. In other words, the farmers will feel the pressure and they will appreciate the risks. Those in government who think that they can force farmers to act in a particular way will also realize that they're not moving. In the end, you have to have a conversation. So you have to have farmers, white farmers, sitting with the black government and say, guys, it is in our interest to do this thing orderly, in a sustainable way, in a win-win situation.
But what prevents that from happening now? Why should we wait for a crisis?
It is this us versus them mentality that I spoke about earlier on. The people in government, they look at farmers as them, right? The farmers look at people in government as them. So it's the us versus them mentality. We have to change, for example, we need to see more and more black people participating actively in commercial farming. Once you have a mix of both black and white in farming, there will be no grounds for people in government to think that the people in farming are not part of them. Because they would know that actually in farming there are whites, there are blacks, which reflects South Africa anyway. So the us versus them mentality will be diminished. That's what we need to do.
Mr. Masongwane, let's come to you. From the business perspective, where do you see this going? What's your contribution to the interaction with government and other stakeholders to make sure that this us and them mentality that is referring to, where people now throttle each other, is done away with?
As business, we believe that we need to have those conversations. And I think this is part of that process where we talk to one another and talk to each other about things that affect us rather than talk against each other. So it is part of that process. The second thing is that we take a sustainability view to the things that we do. It is in the best interest of all stakeholders, government, business, and civil society, and ordinary people in the country, that we make decisions today that will ensure that this country is sustainable in the future. And we can only do that when we are all willing to look at all stakeholders' interests and ensure that we are prepared to each play a role that we should play, give in what we need to give in order to be able to ensure that at the end of the day we have a sustainable food production system. And we can do that if we look at three things. One is if we pass policies that look into the interest of each and every stakeholder. The second one is to make sure that the policies that we pass are in synergy. For example, let's go back to the issue of land reform. If you decide to redistribute land without talking about the issues that Mzi spoke about earlier, what then happens when the people have been relocated to a particular piece of land? What support is it given? What resources are going to be given so that that land continues to be productive? What skills are going to be given? The third issue would be, for example, we need to think, not every person can become a commercial farmer, black or white. Not every Afrikaner can make a commercial farmer, and so not every black person can become a commercial farmer. So we need to allow in our system different food-producing mechanisms. So we should still allow people to have sustainable, to have subsistence farming. So I grew up poor, but I never slept without food because we could produce our own food for our own consumption. There are people who can produce food commercially, and we should allow for all of those systems to coexist.
But I think at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that, not only do we feed ourselves as a nation, but we are also competitive globally in the agricultural space. Our production in agricultural sector versus compared to the overall GDP of the country has been shrinking for a while. So how do we make sure that these debates don't detract us from the imperative of national competitiveness? Let's discuss this matter after the break. Thank you. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. We were talking about the issue of national competitiveness. Our farming, the whole agricultural value chain in South Africa has been very competitive for many years, but it started declining lately. But we know that even the competitiveness of it was mainly driven by the white community for obvious historical reasons and other reasons. Can the white business people in the agricultural sector transfer skills to make sure that everyone is competitive and therefore the nation as a whole is competitive, not just a portion of the nation? Mr. Masonga, I'll start with you and I'll come to Prince.
Yes, I think that can be done. We have run projects as SANVES with emerging and developing farmers, together with commercial farmers, where commercial farmers adopted emerging farmers that they work with and provide technical expertise and mentoring and advice. That is possible. That can actually be done. Our company, for example, focuses on bringing in solutions to farmers that can help with improving their yields, improving their practices, and making them even more efficient. And
so you're not just complaining about government policies?
No, we're not complaining about government policies without doing anything. We are getting involved on the ground with supporting developing farmers. We are working with commercial farmers in actually doing that. The issue is whether or not we can do more. And I believe that actually more can be done.
So what is stopping farmers and other agro businesses from actually doing more?
They are doing more, and it is not only in SANVES that is happening. If you go around the country, you will actually find that there is quite a lot of that happening. But that needs to happen in an enabling environment, in an environment in which government passes policies, provides support, and encourages that kind of interaction between commercial farmers and emerging farmers to actually happen and continue. If on the one hand business is doing something and government comes up and do something that is not supportive of what business is trying to do, if it doesn't like what business is doing, then we need to sit with government and say, what should we be doing that you will support, which will work in the best interest of everybody? Those conversations don't actually take place because business talks to itself, government talks to themselves, and we don't get to a point where we sit together, agree this is the best thing to do in order to accomplish what we would both like to accomplish.
Prince, what's your take on national competitiveness?
I think Joe is right. There is no shared understanding on the part of the players, government and farmers, as to what first is national competitiveness. Number two, to whose benefit? And that, I think, the second point is most important. For example, I know of a farmer in Hazyview in Mpumalanga who produces avocado. He tells me that his avocado is doing very well overseas, so he's making good money, right? But if you go to the local shops in South Africa, avocado is very expensive. Now, do you want South Africans to applaud this farmer who's making lots of money overseas, but they are actually not deriving benefits from the avocado locally? So this is a practical thing. The benefits are not shared equally or fairly. So in other words, those who are in government, when they look at that farmer, they see him as someone who is pursuing self-interest. But that farmer sees himself as part of a bigger South African Inc., and he would like to see national competitiveness. He sees himself as someone who pays tax, right? But there is no shared understanding between the stakeholders as to what are the benefits of national competitiveness. That is the problem. So Joe is right. We are not having the right conversations between stakeholders, and that's what we need to do.
Mzugis, how can we define national competitiveness in the context of the agricultural agro-business sector?
Well, I mean, the first thing is that I think we're having conversations that we should have had, I think, 10, 15 years ago today. The kind of conversations we should be having now is how do we build, grow, and ensure the competitiveness of the agricultural sector, because there are critical things that confront us today. The first is that the sector has been shrinking. Its contribution to the GDP, I understand it hovers around 3%. It has shed 500,000 jobs in a space of I think 10 years, and the investments into the sector are not coming as they should, and there are challenges that face the country, such as the high levels of urbanization. 60%, we are a 60% urbanized economy, and people, and the proportion that is of the population that is involved in the agricultural sector is 6% of groups that are producing food viably and feeding the nation. So the key issue for me is that we are able to feed the nation. One, two, the agricultural sector is viable. It competes with the best in the world, and you can't have that when institutions are not properly in place. The institutions of government, ministers are changing, and you have another minister who comes in and shouts curses upon the industry. So as a country, I feel that sometimes we're cutting our nose to spite our face, because if we throttle the industry, if we throttle agriculture, we will not be able to feed the nation. And currently, where we stand, this is something that touches individuals directly, because if you look at year-on-year food price increases, say March 2015 and March 2016, it's been 9.8%. If you look at the food basket, the first such increase since 2012, and this is likely to worsen with the volatility of the exchange rate as a result of bad policies. Food are going to be more expensive for poor households. So for me, the primary objective should be to sustain the sector, to encourage production, to encourage growth, to encourage competitiveness, while we also talk about issues such as land redistribution. We talk about promoting emerging farmers, small-scale farmers.
Actually, still on that.
Still
on the emerging farmers and supporting them. The ANC recently made a proposal that the retailers, the big retailers, should source a lot of their supplies from emerging farmers. Would that help?
It would help, but obviously at this stage, they will not be able to meet the demand that would come from those retailers. It would help to the extent that it will provide a market for emerging farmers. But the percentage of produce that will come from the emerging farmers is very small at this stage. So it would help from an enterprise development point of view, but it will not help in terms of solving the issues of food availability and affordability of that food.
But surely they would produce more if they had more land.
Certainly, they will produce more if they had more land. If they also have support, if they have the technical expertise that they actually need on the ground, if they have the finances that are required on the ground and the support that they need. So it is a package that needs to be provided to emerging farmers for them to be able to succeed.
And the skills. You can be given finance, land, and everything else. But if you're not a skilled farmer, you can't produce.
Basically, what you are trying to say here is that you need competitiveness in our agricultural colleges or universities who can produce the best farmers. You need competitiveness even in policy making, competitiveness, maybe even in thinking.
Okay, let me give you an example of Mugabe back up north. Mugabe, people say he improved the quality of his education system in Zimbabwe. Yes, it's true. But he neglected a critical area, which is skills production in the agricultural sector. So over 20 years, right, he produced accountants and people in different sectors, but he did not produce agricultural specialists. So when he wanted to take back land chaotically, yes, he did, but there were no skills among black people to sustain production. Now, in South Africa, I think we are actually in the same trap. If you were to ask government, how many agricultural schools in South Africa produce skilled black people every year, you might actually struggle to find an answer. They actually want to distribute land, but they don't know who and how they are going to sustain the land after distribution. And that, I think, is the key question.
Now, that brings us to the issue of labor. We have been discussing here mainly about the relationship between the agricultural sector, as in the business side, and government, and the policies that have caused uncertainty. But if we deal with the question of all stakeholders, in whose interest is the sector working and in whose benefit, surely we can't exclude labor. Next up, we'll be talking about labor. Thank you. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation as we wrap up the discussion. Gentlemen, we were talking about the need to involve workers in the worker issues in the debate. You were speaking about the importance of skills development, which I would imagine would include skilling those workers who work on farms and other agro industries. But also the issue of how that which is generated by these businesses is shared. When government wants to implement minimum wages, the businesses people complain. You are introducing uncertainty, we'll be shedding jobs. On the other hand, there's fast, quick mechanization in the sector, displacing thousands and thousands of workers. How should we make sure that as we improve the cake for food, but we also ensure that the production in that process generate jobs? Mzugis?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be stated is that in the past, we've had this culture of very poor working conditions, very poor working and living conditions in the farms, especially in the Western Cape, where I grew up from. You had all manner of diseases in some of these places. Workers were paid very little. Places like Grabo, your Didorans, where we saw uprising about two years ago, and dissatisfaction with working conditions. I understand that some farmers have since done something to improve living conditions within farms. And also, the second factor is that apart from the historical living arrangements where you find, especially amongst the colored communities that are working in the farms would live within the farm for many years and have very little share of the produce and the profits that are generated by the farm. You have another problem where the sort of newer generation of farm workers live in far-off places such as Khayelitsha, Langa, and so on, and to travel to farms, it hits on their pockets, and this erodes their income. On the other hand, amongst the farmers, the labor cost is one of the highest costs the highest segment in their production cost, because they get squeezed up the value chain, say by retailers and off-takers. So this erodes their margins. So we're battling to find a middle point, a point of equilibrium that satisfies everyone. And if I was a farmer faced with the challenge of an eroded margins, and I'm going to be out of business, I would seriously consider mechanization because we have these structural problems in South Africa that don't require only the initiative of farmers, but also for government to create proper infrastructure where people are living, cheaper modes of transport, and so on.
But maybe the issue is, if there's an upswing, does it get shared? Joe?
It's a difficult question. Does it get shared across the board? No, it doesn't. But it makes business sense to actually share in the event of an upswing.
What stops the agribusiness sector not to share with workers during an upswing?
A lot of companies, I think, do share. If I speak for the company that I work for example, we have incentive schemes in our company that goes all the way to the lowest individual in the company. If we make good profits, we all share in those profits. In hard times, we share the hard times together. And I believe
so you don't have a situation where the executives get paid millions, even during drought season?
If I were to make an example for you, during difficult times, the leadership in our organization takes a decision that we will not take increases, will not take bonuses, but we will actually ensure that the people at the lowest part of the organizations get the increases. And that is the type of leadership that you actually expect of business in general, that you will take into consideration the needs and interest of your people. And I think business is, in fact, going that route.
Prince, let me bring you in here. Mining and agriculture basically are the two industries that have built South Africa to be what it is today. Yet, the toil and the poverty associated with that industrialization of South Africa is unbearable, surely.
Look, here is the thing about the history of this country. The guys who owned a factory, who owned a farm, have always been, in the main, white. And in the head of this guy, when he thought labor, he thought cheap black labor. That's how mining in this country was built. That's how farming in this country was built. Does not mean that that guy did not work. He did work. But it was, in the main, that has been the trend. Now, this is the thing that continues to pollute the debate in South Africa. Because politicians who are looking at the economic system, they look at a white ownership thing versus a cheap black thing. Now, the question is, how do we change that discourse? We can change it. There are models. Take the taxi industry, right? In the taxi industry, that's what makes taxi drivers to wake up at 3 o'clock and work so hard. It is because the way the profit is shared, they have a share in that business, right? The taxi driver gives something to the taxi owner, he also gets something. Imagine a situation where a big agricultural company had a share scheme for workers. So workers know that as they toil, when the company makes profit, there will be a percentage that goes to them. I think that they would work very happy. In fact, a sense of exploitation in the heads of workers, even in the heads of politicians, would not be there. I think if we were to have a situation like that, we would have a much more mature conversation.
Mzugisi, what prevents this kind of model from taking root? Because, the way I understand it, in South Africa, one of the causes of inequalities is that the return on capital, as Piketty writes, has been bigger than, well, the return on capital is bigger than the return of the other stakeholders, like, labor. So their income from the business is less than the return that capital gets out of it. So this whole thing causes huge inequalities. But how can we get schemes like the one that Prince is describing to be embraced as the norm in the agricultural sector, so that we do away with the idea that business is there to exploit workers?
I think in the economy in general and in agriculture in particular, we do need new imagination. We need to be imaginative. And I think we need to move beyond, the binary tension between, say, government and business around, say, minimum labor or the kind of redistribution that has been pandered, and to think of new and better ways to approach this. I mean, in the past, there were sharecropper schemes. They may not necessarily have functioned optimally, but I certainly think that going forward, what Joe and Prince were referring to, the share, the share schemes are something that need to be put in place, and I understand that some farms are experimenting with some of these. And this is not just a South African thing. There's a growing talk globally about inclusive business, business coalition for action, which was launched in the UN in 2008, talks about the importance of building very strong linkages between, say, for an example, smallholder farmers and large emerging farmers. And this kind of thinking needs to also go, it needs to be considered with respect to farm workers, because wages will not be sufficient to sustain their livelihood because of the factors that I've highlighted, the structural factors. They stay far from the areas of work, the taxes are expensive, and so on.
Gentlemen, we've come to the end of the discussion now. Thank you for your contribution. It is clear that we cannot have answers to all the questions, but I think that the conversation should continue in different platforms, in academia where you are participating, and Mr. Maswangani in the business sector. You must continue to push the conversation, and hopefully our nation will somehow get together and have some consensus and do away with what Prince was referring to about the us and them, so that at the end of the day, when we talk about national competitiveness, we're talking about competitiveness of all South Africans in the agricultural sector, not just a portion of some of the South Africans in the sector. Join the conversation. Download the Nation in Conversation app available in the App Store. Follow us on Twitter @NationConverse. More information is available on the website nationinconversation.co.za. This is Nation in Conversation. Goodbye.
The world is changing today. The world is changing in every way. Let's stand together, put our hands together, join hands forever. We're making it better. No matter where you are, you could be near or far away. We're singing